word translation originally comes from the Latin for to carry across. The etymological link between translation and travel in many languages suggests a deep conceptual connection between the two activities. Travel writers and translators are both cultural intermediaries who encounter foreign languages in their professional lives. Travel narratives have always circulated in translation. As early as the 14th century, Jean de Mandeville's Voyages were available in 3 contemporary English translations. Unsurprisingly, translations of travel writing have tended to reflect discoveries and geopolitics. For instance, translating Dutch works of travel was vital to French and British interests to break the Dutch East India Company's monopoly over the Cape of Good Hope and the Straits of Magellan. Translated travel narratives were very popular with readers in the Great Age of Discovery and into the 18th century. Many anthologies were published, and before copyright came into force, in the 19th century, many travel narratives came out in competing translations. And these are interesting to compare in terms of ideology and strategy. To take one example, François Le Vaillant's 1790 travel narrative, Voyage dans l'intérieur de l'Afrique par le Cap de Bonne-Espérance, was translated twice within a year of publication. The first, anonymous translation, probably by a man, was described by contemporary critics as suitable for, I quote, the philosopher and physician, suggesting an educated male readership. The second, by Elizabeth Helm, was for those who wish for a more pleasing, agreeable narrative. Working for a non-specialist readership that included women, she removed potentially risque material such as allusions to nudity. In the publishing boom of the early 19th century, travel writing remained hugely popular. It accounted for 1/5 of all translations in Britain. And this period also saw a broadening of the parameters of translation beyond the modern European gaze, as more translations from non-European languages were being published. Examples include the first English version of the 14th century Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta's Travels by Samuel Lee in 1829. And this is also the period when non-European travellers to England began to see their travel narratives translated into English. For instance, the Persian Indian administrator Mirza Abu Talib Khan had an account of his time in Britain and Europe which was translated from Persian by Charles Stewart in 1810. And typical of his time, Stewart reshaped the narrative in accordance with European textual norms, pointing out in the preface that he had found it necessary to transpose the chapters in order to preserve a connection between the subjects, an object little attended to by Oriental writers in general. By the early 20th century, most of the blank spaces on the globe had been filled in. Perhaps the last translated travel narrative to familiarise European readers with a wholly mysterious part of the world was Alexandra David-Néel's 1927 My Journey to Lhasa. Much of the information once found in travel writing was now packaged in travel guides. Baedeker began translating his famous German guides for the pan-European market in 1861. As travel guides developed, travel writing became more overtly literary in the work of writers such as Patrick Leigh Fermor. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, travel narratives are still often translated. Translated travel guides, in particular, offer interesting examples of localization, adapting their content to the specific cultural expectations of their readers. Translators have historically engaged in practices such as abridgment and paratextual commentary to adapt texts to new publishing and reading contexts. François Pouqueville's 1805 Voyage en Morée, for instance, was cut from over 1,000 pages in French to under 200 in the first English translation of 1806. And translated travel narratives have also helped shape the recipient culture, bringing in new words to describe alien concepts. The Golden Age of exploration saw words such as hurricane and kimono enter European languages via translated travel narratives. One particular problem was how to translate exotic features of foreign countries that were unknown in Europe, such as plants and animals. And translators used a range of strategies to handle unfamiliar concepts, from simply leaving them out, to using loanwords, glosses, or replacing them with familiar equivalents. Elizabeth Helm uses various strategies to introduce unfamiliar South African birds to her readers. She sometimes uses the French term with an explanation between brackets. Sometimes she simply uses the name of a familiar European bird. The translator's role as mediator between traveller and foreign language environment also lets them reshape information ideologically. Jacques de Migrod's retitling of his translation of Bartolomé de las Casas' Brevissima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, 1552, as Tyrannie et cruauté des Espagnols perpétrées es Inde occidentale, 1579, is one telling example, denouncing Spanish colonial practices in the New World. Though modern readers expect translations not to engage in ideological manipulation, but to be faithful to the original, translations are still subtly reframed to meet target culture expectations. Claudia Magris's 1986 masterpiece Danubio, for example, was given a new subtitle in English, A Sentimental Journey from the Source to the Black Sea, to associate the title with Lawrence Stern's English-language travel classic, A Sentimental Journey. In the late 20th century, post-colonial and feminist scholars began to challenge the dominance of Western, largely male, authors in travel writing. Women's travel writing proved an abundant historical resource. The University of Wolverhampton's database of women's travel writing in Britain between 1780 and 1840 lists 16 translations by women, almost none of which have been studied at all. It's harder to track down writings by authors native to the colonies, which are by their very nature scattered, hard to locate in library catalogues, and often in languages rarely spoken by European scholars. The impact of post-colonial theory in travel writing has therefore largely been to ensure the international circulation of authors like V.S. Naipaul, who've entered the post-colonial canon by means of publication in imperial centres. It is, however, worth noting that translations of travel narratives were not necessarily produced by translators from the imperial centre. Mirza Irfan Ali Beg's 1896 Pilgrimage to Mecca, originally published in Urdu, was self-translated into English in Benares in 1896. Another interesting example of how travel narratives came to be reframed is Uganda's Katikiro in England, recounting the official visit by the Ugandan Katikiro, the Prime Minister, to Edward VII's coronation. This was written by his secretary, Ham Mukasa, and translated from the Lugandan by the missionary Ernest Miller in 1904. Miller's preface is somewhat patronising. Some of the impressions are obviously false ones, and many of the numbers given are quite unreliable, but I have not attempted to rectify such things as I think they add to the charm of the book. In 1975, the work was reprinted as Sir Apollo Kagwa Discovers Britain in Heinemann's African Writers series. Miller's translation was abridged and edited by the Sudanese-Ugandan academic Tabanyo Iliyonga, who removed Miller's preface and concludes his text with a cry for Ugandan unity. And the back cover deliberately and ironically reverses the imperial gaze by describing the Prime Minister's trip to darkest industrial Britain, where he views the teeming natives with the amazed eye of a Livingstone. Translation has played a key role in informing readers about the changing world in which we live. Travel texts have for centuries moved very concretely around Europe and beyond, with translation bringing books into new regions and new communities. Translations of travel writing has brought the whole world into readers' bookshops, libraries, and homes.